here's Bernadette at, I'll tell you where this reading was. Oh, here at Penn. It was the Writers House Fellows reading that Bernadette did a few years ago.
So I found this poem that I was telling you about. It's called Chocolate Poetry Sonnet. When my children were growing up, we never had candy at home, but when we went to poetry readings, I always brought them chocolate bars to make the poetry palatable or more interesting, or so they'd be relatively quiet. It only backfired if the reading lasted too long. Then there was hell to pay, but I deserved it, didn't I? After a while, if I knew the reading would be long, I'd bring 2 chocolate bars. So I began to think of long readings as 2 chocolate bar readings. Eventually, I'd bring 2 just in case, sometimes saving 1 for the next occasion. Poetry is as good as chocolate. Chocolate as good as poetry is.
Bernadette always laughed at her own poems because of just the humor of it and also just the pleasure of reading. So we're going to start with Jason. I'm going to invite Jason to be the one to narrow the topic of our discussion if Jason wants. Or say whatever you want to say.
I'm thinking, when I was listening to this poem, I was interested in the minutia of, being so technical about the chocolate bars and having like this relatively like complex system. and I wonder though, like I could, in a way, unlike a lot of things we've read up to this point, this poem to my ear when she was reading it could have been it could have been prose, but it's not. It's a poem. So I'm curious about the what work is being done on the language by it being framed as a poem, and in which it's a poem in which poetry readings are being made fun of.
Yeah.
So it's that metapoetic, or
yes,
it's reflexive in that
it's
way.
Also, it's not just metapoetic, but it has a metapoetic relationship to the institution of the poetry reading as an event and as a space in which parenting must take place, because it's a place of social responsibility. I love that focus. I think that's great, and I haven't thought about that quite that way. So we're going to go to Sophia next, followed by Erica, and Graham, I would love for you to get in on the conversation, and also Dave.
Well, I'm thinking about the measure of time in this poem, and I'm thinking about all the different marks of measuring time that we see. Like the first line is "children are growing up," and that's like
Is that what the first line is?
Yeah, when my children were growing up.
I hadn't even thought of that.
So there's this like huge, long expanse of time that a child grows up within, but it's also like broken down into measures of smaller time, like a 2 chocolate bar reading. That's a long one. And it's making me think of the different ways we measure our time and how that shifts as we grow up. Like when I was a kid, it was time to come home when the streetlights turned on. And I have no idea what time that actually was in the scope of the day, but I knew that specific time that the lights turned on, it was my time to go home. And I just think it's like, it's just a sonnet is kind of a meaty form anyway. And so I'm just thinking about like melting all these readings into this one pot of like physical reward that these kids sat through. And I don't know, it's delicious.
It is delicious. Lainey, I'm going to break break the order here because we're going to turn to Erica next, and Graham and Dave. But I just want to throw at you a general New York school question. Isn't
Sure.
it? I'm going to make a statement, and then you can agree or disagree and riff.
Okay.
I think the contribution of the New York school, especially the present tense poems, especially the I do this, I do that poems, O'Hara's Day Lady Died being sort of the classic in this course, they're playing with the idea that time marked in a poem, in the actions of a poem, can be messed with, stretched, and can be compared to the poem time, the time in which the poem gets enacted, the time in which the poem is heard or read too, but that it takes Bernadette Mayer in the so-called second generation to actually explore further what time means in all the meta senses. And I'm beginning to think this discussion today is putting me in mind that Bernadette Mayer may be the poet, as it were, of our time, the poet of the idea of time, parenting time, mother time, getting from one place to the next time, being with others time, in a way that feminist readings of Bernadette work to explore. And it may be, in addition, a redefinition of New York school, disregarding gender. It's an overall triumph that she's accomplishing here. And I would love for you to react to the question of time.
Wow. Well, I feel like the question of time is connected to what we're going to talk about with the invasion of the body snatchers.
Definitely.
Kind of exactly. So I'm going to go a little bit sideways and say that the New York school is so much about sociability, that I do this and I do that, and being in relation in this pleasurable way, in which most poets are not having kids, or the kids are totally invisible in the poem. And part about the thing I love about the poetry, chocolate poetry sonnet, also as a parent who had young kids and was trying to get to poetry readings, is that it's like whatever it takes. How am I going to get there? I don't have a babysitter. I don't have money for a babysitter. I don't want to miss the event. I don't want to give my kids too much sugar. So I'm going to reserve candy, chocolate, so I can go to the reading with my children.
And get a poem out of it.
Right. So it's a kind of this, it makes visible that work of parenting, which mostly was taboo, mostly wasn't talked about, mostly men would say, oh, well, she's not serious because she's having children. So
and you did much better than I did, Lainey. Thank you in suggesting the topic, because it is about poets' time. Does a poet have time? You think of some, classic, I don't know, 19th century, I always mess with 19th century novelists, some classic 19th century novelist who's shut the family out, go away, or finds a space, and then does the durational work of writing a novel. Bernadette thought that was bullshit.
Yeah, and she also loved being a mother and being a poet, and didn't ever think of it as, we're looking at the socioeconomic difficult realities of time and resources, but her attitude was always, the children are an inspiration, and the children are in the poem, and the children are writing the poem with her.
Beautiful, thank you. We're going to go to Erica, then Graham, then Dave, and somewhere in there we're going to get someone in who's just called us. So, Erica, thoughts on this?
Yeah, there are two things that I'm thinking about, and one, building on what Lainey said, I would just add that there's a way in which this poem is also drawing attention to often invisible labor, and really naming that as a productive space for poetry making. And, kind of relatedly thinking about form, I'm in a form mood today. I love form. So I'm thinking about what a great sonnet and how it does the Shakespearean thing, but it does it again differently, where, the 12 lines or, the block develops this scenario, which Lainey was beautifully reading, as far as, the idea of making visible the act of mothering and inviting the children in to be an inspiration, and, not staying at home and those sorts of things. And then those last two lines do something very different, where, we're not solving the situation or coming to any sort of conclusion. We're continuing to open things out.
Yes. Sonnet. So the Shakespearean sonnet, forgive me for the condensation, it's often about two things, love and the nation.
Yep.
And Bernadette does both of those by, first, including in love, not the, some dark, mystical object of desire. Sorry, I just sort of waved away a whole bunch of Shakespeare, and I didn't mean to do that. But and turn that into a love of your children, to want them to witness what's going on in your world, which is to say poetry readings. And second, the nation becomes the poetry community that you need and must get to, even if the kids are going to be annoying and interrupted, because those are your people. And Bernadette felt that. I mean, she felt it. So the nation becomes the poetry community. Let's go to Graham, and then Dave, and then we'll go to the phone. Graham, what are you thinking?
What I'm thinking probably connects with what Jason said right at the beginning about this being kind of metapoetic or commentary on the poetry reading as a form or a space. But what I really like about this is the kind of conversational tone, right? I deserved it, right? But within what's a more kind of classic and staid and traditional and structured form than a sonnet, right? So she's got that kind of conversational, ironic, arch tone where she's talking to somebody else about the experience. But she's managed to put that into a really structured classical format.
Yeah.
I think it's great.
Yeah, that is great. Erica's, it's Form Day up there in the Hudson Valley, and so Erica's Form Day seems to have extended down to the Middle Atlantic. Every day should be Form Day. Dave, your thoughts on this? Then we'll go to the phone.
What I really like is how there are multiple experiences going on or being described. There's the creative, the poetry reading itself, which is sort of the subject of the story, but it's in the background. And then there's the practical reality, the real focus of what the poem is saying. And they're very, very different things. But also, if you take a step back, you can actually look and say, hey, that's actually what the poem itself is doing. It's describing the practical reality of stuff, but through the creative act of poetry. So, it's almost like flip, where you read it in the first sense, it's sort of like poetry that's wrapped in this practical reality of the words of the poem. But in another sense, it's also like practical reality wrapped in the form of a poem. So it's
well
a lot.
said. The comments that have been made put me in mind of third space theorizing, where in this case the room of the poetry reading is a third space. The first space being, of course, the home and family with its own socializing pressures. And the second space is a standard classroom. And when David and I were riffing together about what happens when a poem goes into a non-Milesian classroom or some traditional classroom, that place becomes a second place. But the third space is a space in which this great now gone poet drags her children to it, and then makes the poem a site of a different kind of learning for them, right? And it's a space that acknowledges what it's going to take to get these young people to want to be educated to the sociality of a poetry reading and a poetry space. I think, Erica, somebody, maybe the two of us, needs to write about this poem as radical pedagogy, as a Freirean third space, because it's drawing us to it. And it also should make us envy the kind of person who can take all the frustrations of the day, and pull the kids into a world that is a world where the people in the room are committed to learning by trying to mix the miles, trying to piece together the things that have been given to you, which includes a chocolate bar.